commenting on the emerging material turn in opera studies, Jonathan Stern has cautioned of the need to define what we mean by a term as seductive yet baggy as materiality. Yet even if we sidestep the confusion of the competing Marxist, media-theoretical, neuroscientific, ontological or ecological materialities that Stern invokes, and seek instead to start with a more naive quest for opera's actual material traces, its objects and its things, where would the limits of such a search lie? And must the realm of the material for the opera scholar necessarily function, as Stern suggests, as a way to get at the immaterial, the ephemeral, the mortal? What, in short, would or could a material history of opera look like? Such questions seem to crowd in when writing a paper about the Palais Garnier, and when feeling at once impressed and oppressed by its material excess, by its sheer overdetermination as a symbol of grand operatic culture, and by its continued existence as a repository for certain kinds of operatic fantasies, indulged as much by the scholars in its library as by the tourists posing on its grand staircase. Perhaps better then to approach the question more obliquely. What might a material history of opera seem most likely to leave out? Based on recent literature, I would hazard that it would pass over those material traces which seem least enchanted, or least historically innovative, which often amounts to much the same thing. The most studied materials of operatic history, unsurprisingly, tend towards the sort of resonantly suggestive objet trouvé that Nicholas Matthew and Mary Ann Smart have termed quirk objects. The large larynx, two dried testicles, musical score and shellac disc, for instance, that serve as the focal points for a clutch of materially conscious opera books surveyed a couple of years ago by Laura Tunbridge. Or else, perhaps all the heliographs, phonotographs, microphones, wax cylinders, telegraphs, radio broadcasts and moving images that populate the Kunstkammer-like chronology that opens Karen Henson's recent collection of essays on technology and the diva, the book for which Stern's reflections on operatic materiality serve as an afterword. The authors of the chronology are quick to acknowledge it as a dubious genre, but do so with reference to the problems of dating and the difficulties of singling out originators, rather than to the principles of selection. And sure enough, despite the chronology's novel intent, its narrative of production history, at least, interwoven with other events, closely shadows earlier histories, proceeding from the invention of limelight in 1803, to the innovative use of gaslight in the Nuns' Ballet in Robert le Diable in 1831, to the electrical sunrise of Le Prophète in 1849, followed by the turn away from Paris towards the new technology for Parsifal at Bayreuth in 1882, and the innovations in scenery and staging proposed in Adolf Appier's Die Musik und die Inszenierung of 1899. So what, then, might a different sort of material history of operatic production look like? And for my purposes today, how might it address an issue like the well-known failure to incorporate any significant innovations into the theatrical machinery of Charles Garnier's new Opéra, despite instructions to do so in the initial prospectus for the building, and despite the deliberations of a commission over more than a decade explicitly set up to assess new technological developments? Stern points out that as long as opera is treated as separate from its surrounding technological apparatus, some technologies, such as microphones and cameras, will receive disproportionate attention, while others, the stage, say, or the architecture of the opera house, will be mystified. Mystified is Stern's word, and at first sight, downplayed might seem to work just as well. But on reflection, perhaps mystified is better, since it keeps in sight the way that so much of the history of operatic staging remains at root aesthetically inclined, shaped around the contemplation of past enchantment. Enchantment through innovation. Here, for instance, is how the arc lights were employed for the sunrise of Le Prophète, runs the text. And just imagine the effect for the first audience, runs the subtext. Or enchantment through bathetic quirk. Think about those little boys instructed to jump around under a large canvas to simulate a stormy sea. Or else just enchantment through the unrecoverable sublime, whether in the form of reproductions of scene designs from famous grand operas in books like Evan Baker's lavish recent history of operatic production, from the score to the stage, or else as in John Tresh's Romantic Machine, which focuses on the way that mechanism and romanticism became intertwined in Paris in the first half of the 19th century, in order to tune us back in to the lost thrills of the Meyerbeerian phantasmagoria. All of those examples come from the first half of the 19th century, of course. And Tresch significantly draws a distinction between what he sees as the fertile intersections between the arts and the sciences of the 1820s and 30s, and what he terms the mechanistic materialism and rigid disciplinary divisions that took command after mid-century in the Second Empire. And if I were to rephrase my opening question one more time, in order to ask what a mechanistically materialist history of opera production might look like, the Palais Garnier would seem an obvious place to look for an answer. Take, for example, one of the books published to commemorate the eventual inauguration of the new building on the 3rd of January 1875, written by the Opéra's archivist Charles Nuité. Having listed the 13 painters, 73 sculptors, and 19 ornamental sculptors who carried out the building's decoration, along with all those overseeing all the other trades involved in the construction, Nuité then devoted his closing pages to a thorough material reckoning of the new building. From the number of sacks of plaster used in the building, 465,900, via the total length of cast iron, copper, and lead piping, 6,918 meters, to the capacity of the various water reservoirs, 105,000 liters, and even the total number of keys issued to the building, 7,593. And then comes the theatrical machinery, the 288 columns in cast iron, with a total weight of 146,680 kilograms, the 512 iron beams of 437,950 kilograms, 122,000 kilograms of counterweights in iron and lead, 223,100 meters of hemp rope, 12,700 meters of iron cable made up of no less than 7,563,000 meters of wire, and so on. Such statistical sublimity had in fact been a defining feature of the new Opéra project from early on, with Garnier's own annual reports through the 1860s to the Comte de Walewski, the Minister of State responsible for overseeing the project, including detailed charts outlining numbers of man-hours worked, numbers of injuries sustained, amounts of different materials used, etc., etc. But also giving a running total of the number of separate drawings undertaken in the process of design and construction, which, in his 1867 report, Garnier calculated could stretch 33 kilometers end to end, or, as he added, all the way to Versailles along the right bank of the Seine, and then all the way back along the left. And it's hard not to see these obsessive calculations of work undertaken and monumentality attained, born not just of the Second Empire's particular strain of bureaucratic fever, but also of a desire to demonstrate quality through quantity, as if the proof of effort invested and infrastructure constructed could help the Opéra towards the terrifying cultural demands to which it had been subjected from its conception. After all, if the official government decree launching the competition for an architectural design in 1860 had been terse, mentioning only the public utility of a new opera house, there were plenty of people all too willing to spell out the stakes at a much higher pitch. César Daly, introducing the decree in the Revue de l'Architecture et des Travaux Publics, suggested that national utility, at least, might have been a better phrase, given the clear national interest in a project that would confirm Paris as the artistic capital of Europe. De la Mare in La Patrie agreed, writing that the new opera house, to answer to the splendour of the capital, must be, in its external proportions, in the grandiose character of its interior arrangements, a theatre without rival in Europe. Or else, as the concluding lines of a celebratory hymn written for the 1875 inauguration would put it, France, mother of the arts, fulfill your destiny, that they should come, your children, to take their place in the festivities, that before this palace they raise their heads high, that their brows might be imprinted with a noble pride. Here is progress, here is conquest, here is grandeur and immortality. I could stop there. For all the bombast of this peroration, its final string of nouns nevertheless manages unintentionally to capture something of the near impossibility underlying the entire enterprise, stuck between the future orientation of progress and conquest and the more static claims of grandeur and immortality. How could the Opéra serve both as a showroom for the existing luxury of French and European operatic grandeur, and at the same time look ahead, leading the art form on towards the 20th century? This is a question that, of course, has been posed many times since, perhaps with an eye on the building's ornate classicism, or to the famous fact that the night of the inauguration saw a parade of operatic excerpts from the 1820s and 30s, rather than any new composition. But it was in the realm of stage machinery that the greatest hopes had initially been invested for the creation of something genuinely new, and not before time, as Dali wrote in 1860. Who would believe it? In an era when the mechanical rules and governs, in a society founded on industry and commerce, both of which depend on the genius of the mechanical, at the heart of the nation most addicted to pleasure, of the town which wants and deserves to have the first opera in the world, on the banks of the Seine, no less, where we have learnt to say, as often as on the banks of the Thames, time is money. Who would believe it? The mechanism of scenery has made no progress for 200 years. In this context, the present Opéra in Paris perfectly resembles the Salle des Machines, as the old theatre in the Tuileries was called. I don't think I'm mistaken in saying that the Opéra of the Rue Le Pelletier had installed on its stage all the material from the theatre on the Rue Richelieu, demolished following the assassination of the Duc de Berry. The detailed official programme outlining the task for those entering the competition to build the new Opéra cast even further back, claiming that the machines of the opera are still today that those existed at the time of the Marquis de Sourdeillac, a machinist of the late 17th century. Since 1672 they have lost nothing or very little, but they have not made a single step of progress. And then again, at the other end of this story, over a decade after the inauguration, an article on theatrical machinery in 1884 reiterated the position and looked even further into the past, observing that in this age of iron, the opera, as an art that touches civilization the most and that serves in a way as a measure of its progress, nevertheless still remained faithful to its ancient traditions, in which theatrical machinery was constructed out of wood by master craftsmen working like carpenters of the Middle Ages. The hopes for the new Opéra as a testing ground for new ideas, in other words, had foundered. And as Edwin Sachs would put it in his vast 1896 survey of modern opera houses and theatres, a great opportunity lost. The German-speaking countries were left to do what France so curiously failed in, Sachs went on, adding that Charles Garnier, I know, still mourns this lost opportunity. And sure enough, during the years of construction of the Opéra and those that followed, reports came in of innovations involving steam, gas and electricity at new opera houses in Vienna, Budapest, Wiesbaden and elsewhere, of a kind that Paris had signally failed to introduce. I'm not about to overturn the basic elements of this story today. Some of the innovations considered and rejected for the Garnier did indeed appear later elsewhere. And all the deliberations on theatrical machinery at the Opéra, both during the 1860s and in later years, certainly confirm the existence of a strong strain of conservatism there that worked against the employment of novel techniques. As late as 1915, for instance, during belated discussions on replacing the 1875 machinery with an entirely metallic system, we still find appeals to the continued value of the old apparatus that had worked for so many generations, as well as reports of almost 850 painted backdrops stuffed tight together in the flies above the stage, hanging above the performers like a portentous reminder of the tradition as literal dead weight, with no possible space for new designs ever to be introduced. To read the reports submitted to the Special Commission on Theatrical Machinery set up under Garnier in the 1860s, meanwhile, is to see a procession of different schemes and inventions considered, only for one after another to be ruled out. Add to this budget constraints, so that when something finally was approved, it turned out to be too expensive, and the need to complete the final stages of construction quickly after the previous opera house burnt down in 1873, and it's not hard to see the process as indeed a failure, of a kind also traceable through Garnier's own writings of the period. In his Études sur les théâtres, for instance, which Garnier presented to the Minister of State in the 1860s, he comments on the generally undeveloped state of theatrical machinery all over Europe, before turning to consider a particular innovation specified in the competition programme for the Opéra, for a new way to hang the large pieces of upright scenery, the châssis, from horizontal poles that would extend across the width of the stage. Garnier outlined the great advantages of such a system. He mentions a model of it that he had made for the minister and for the emperor, and he sketches out the possible addition of some kind of iron ceiling above the stage to protect the scenery from fire when it was being stored, and to prevent the singers' voices getting lost in the upper reaches of the flies, and to create a surface for the machinists to move around on safely. He goes further. If such a system were to be run by steam, gas, or electricity, each piece of scenery could then be linked to a sort of keyboard, so that at the touch of a key, a machinist could make scenery disappear and new scenes appear, leading to quick and effortless transformations. Only at the end of this extended fantasy does Garnier add a brief footnote, which simply reads, "Since the period in which this report was written, this system has been examined and studied by the Special Commission and rebuffed for involving very great disadvantages." By 1866, in his official report to the Minister on the works carried out at the Opéra that year, he recommends using the Commission only selectively anymore, to explore the principles of outstanding projects, such as the idea of a mobile stage floor where sections could be raised or lowered by hydraulic presses, but that after this he would regain control in consultation with a specialist or two. As a result, just 3 or 4 meetings of the Commission should be enough to agree to an outline, with extra meetings only if necessary. Though, Garnier writes to the Minister, I doubt this would be necessary, since in any commission there is always at least one person who talks and digresses the whole time, and stops serious people from speaking their minds. It doesn't quite work, though, to turn Garnier into a thwarted genius, held back by pettifogging bureaucrats, marking time, setting up meetings upon meetings. For one thing, once Garnier came to publish his broad reflections on the state of the contemporary stage in 1871 as Le Théâtre, he is very clear about the disadvantages as well as the advantages of the various proposals that the Commission had received, whether for types of circular panorama to replace the flat scenic backdrops, or for the introduction of hydraulics to assist with moving the chariots, the trolleys, that manoeuvred heavy scenery onto the stage. Moreover, he explicitly sought to forestall accusations that this amounted to an unthinking preference for the habitual, writing instead that one recognizes that what is called routine is nothing other than experience, and the status quo is only the continuity of good practice. So although once complete, Garnier left room in the Opéra for future installation of new systems, should the money ever be forthcoming, throughout its construction, he adhered to a sort of pragmatic approach to what was possible and what was desirable technologically, within a particular building constructed to perform a particular repertoire. His approach, in fact, resonates with Jonathan Stern's own definition of technology as repeatable social, cultural, and physical processes crystallized into mechanisms, in a way that leads me to 3 observations by way of conclusion. First, and most straightforwardly, I would suggest that we should be paying more attention to what David Edgerton has termed a use-based history of technology, which focuses on continuities of practice as well as innovations. And that, in line with classic 19th century texts on theatrical production, like Moinet's L'Envers du Théâtre of 1873, begins from the everyday activity of staging practice rather than from its exceptional moments. This would allow us to follow the ways in which practices did in fact change through the period, but gradually and for different motives. In this light, moreover, we might recast the nature of the Garnier failure, not least by thinking what might have actually happened had some of the innovations proposed been introduced. This brings me to my second point, which is simply a reminder that most of the new technologies explored at the Opéra were not particularly new. The hydraulic press, for example, had been invented at the end of the 18th century and was widely employed in industry by the mid-19th, and the steam engine before that. The possibility of replacing wood with iron, meanwhile, dated back following Walter Benjamin's famous description of the Parisian arcades at least to the 1820s. No surprise, then, that the innovation-obsessed scientific press of the 1860s paid very little attention to stage machinery at the Opéra, preferring to explore matters such as acoustics, ventilation, and auditorium lighting for the new building, or to report breathlessly on events like the building of a special railway down the Champs-Élysées in 1863, in order to transfer the 2-ton model of the new Opéra to the Palais de l'Industrie. Finally, we should recognize that even a history of staging built on novelty was only ever partly about aesthetic wonderment. Given the Wagnerian legacy of concentrating on transformations of practice to intensify the suspension of disbelief, it's salutary to see in the proposals put before the Commission an equal or greater concern for measures to reduce fire risk, and, surprisingly perhaps, above all, to reduce manpower. Think of Dali writing, "Time is money." César Dali, in 1860, spoke in awe of a new theatre in Boston that took only 25 machinists to perform maneuvers that would take 100 in Paris. And it was a sentiment that would be echoed time and again in the decades to come. This might lead us to question, once more with Stern, how or whether opera was so different to other media or to other industries at the time. But it might equally encourage us to stop imagining ourselves only in the audience at the Opéra, ready and willing to be amazed, and to move instead to the world of pulleys, flats, practicables, and counterweights, to the experience of the Opéra, for instance, from the perspective of a machinist 3 or 4 floors under the stage. To write the material history of 19th century stage technologies, in other words, we need to discover or rediscover a different form of operatic enchantment, the enchantment of what one might call the backstage sublime. Thank you.